For 22 years, a telescope the size of a school bus fell around the Earth without ever touching it. That's what orbit is technically, a controlled fall. And Swift did it 87,000 times, scanning the sky for the most violent explosions in the universe. Gamma-ray bursts so bright they outshine entire galaxies for the length of a coffee break. NASA built it to last 2 years. It lasted 22. And then, this past spring, one of its gyroscopes failed and the fall became something else. What happened next is what this is really about, because the engineers who built Swift knew, somewhere in the back of their minds, that this day would come. They just didn't plan for it. Not really. And that gap between knowing something will end and actually preparing for the end is one of the most human things there is. It has a name, and understanding it might be the most useful thing you do this week. The Swift Gamma-ray Burst mission launched in November 2004. Its designers gave it a 2-year design life. That wasn't pessimism. It was honest engineering. The batteries degrade, the gyroscopes wear, the attitude control jets run dry. 2 years was the number the systems could reliably promise. But Swift kept working. A year past its deadline, then 3, then 5. Each year NASA reviewed it. Each year it still outperformed every other telescope in its class, and each year the agency renewed it. 22 years, 11 times longer than it was ever supposed to run. There's something in that number that should stop you cold. Not because it's impressive, though it is. Because of what it reveals about how we plan. The engineers didn't design a telescope for 22 years. They designed one for 2 and then kept being surprised when it still worked. Every renewal was a gift they weren't expecting. And because they weren't expecting it, they weren't ready when it ended. When the gyroscope failed in April 2025, NASA had roughly 7 months. 7 months to design, build, and launch a rescue mission before Swift's orbit decayed enough to end science operations permanently. 7 months to save a 22-year legacy that was never supposed to need saving. That scramble, that frantic backward sprint to a contingency nobody had ready, is the story inside the story. And the moment you understand why they were caught flat-footed, you'll start to see the same pattern everywhere in your own life. Psychologists call it the planning fallacy. The term comes from Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who documented it in the late 1970s and found it to be almost universal. When people estimate how long a project will take, they systematically underestimate. Not because they're sloppy, because the human brain, when imagining the future, naturally runs the best-case scenario. The one where nothing breaks, the one where the gyroscopes hold, the one where you have more time than you actually do. Kahneman later connected this to something deeper, which he called optimism bias. It's not just that we think our projects will go faster than they will, it's that we think our risks are lower than they are. Our marriage is more durable, our health more resilient, our friendships more forgiving of neglect. We aren't naive exactly. We know, in the abstract, that things fail. We just don't include that knowledge in our actual plans. We design the 2-year telescope. We don't design the rescue mission. Think about the last significant thing you started. A job, a relationship, a side project you were quietly excited about. Did you ever sit down and ask, what does this look like when it starts to fail? Not if. When? Did you build a rescue mission into the original plan? Most people haven't. Not because they don't care. Because the mind that builds the hopeful plan is constitutionally reluctant to poison it with the image of its own failure. Optimism bias isn't a character flaw. It's a structural feature of the way we imagine forward. Here's the thing, most people who understand optimism bias still get wrong. They think the antidote is pessimism. Lower your expectations, Assume the worst. Plan for failure from day one, and you won't be surprised. But that's not what the evidence suggests, and it's not what Swift's engineers needed. What they needed wasn't doubt. It was a specific kind of structured imagination, applied before the gyroscope failed, not after. Picture a project manager at her desk on a Thursday morning, coffee going cold beside her keyboard. The project is 6 months old, still ahead of schedule, still under budget. Everything is fine. And she closes her laptop and asks a question that feels almost rude to ask when things are going well. Assume this project has failed completely. Assume it's 18 months from now, and we're writing the autopsy report. What killed it? She isn't being defeatist. She's doing a pre-mortem. And that one uncomfortable question changes everything she does next. The pre-mortem is a technique developed by Gary Klein, a cognitive psychologist who spent decades studying how experts make decisions under pressure. The idea is simple in principle and uncomfortable in practice. Before you launch the plan, you run it forward in your imagination to a point where it has already failed. Then you work backwards and ask what went wrong. This isn't pessimism. It's prospective hindsight. And Klein's research found that it dramatically improves our ability to spot risks we'd otherwise miss, because the imagination is better at finding failure modes when it's allowed to assume they already happened. Most people who say they've thought about what could go wrong have only thought about it lightly. They've done a brief, uncomfortable scan of the horizon, found nothing immediately obvious, and returned to the comfortable plan. The pre-mortem forces you past that. It's not what might fail. It's, it failed. Now what happened? The shift from possibility to certainty unlocks a different kind of thinking. Your brain stops defending the plan and starts honestly examining it. NASA didn't run a pre-mortem on Swift's gyroscopes failing at year 22. They probably couldn't have, not specifically. But the practice of designing rescue missions, of funding contingency work before the crisis rather than scrambling for it after, is exactly what a pre-mortem culture builds. You don't need to predict the specific failure. You need to build the habit of assuming that something will fail and asking what you'd wish you had done when it does. The answer to that question is your rescue mission. Build it now. You already know what I'm pointing at in your own life. The project that's been losing altitude. The relationship where you've both been coasting, telling yourselves there's more time. The version of your career you meant to build and keep meaning to start. You haven't been naive. You've been human. But there's a quiet gap between knowing something can fail and actually sitting down to design for that failure. The gap is where the 7-month scramble lives. You can close it. Swift doesn't get its rescue mission. The reboost vehicle NASA is scrambling to build launches, June 27th, and if it works, the telescope gets more years. If it doesn't, one of the most productive observatories in history ends, not with a decommissioning ceremony, but with an uncontrolled re-entry. A controlled fall becoming an uncontrolled one. 22 years of gamma-ray bursts, of watching stars collapse and black holes form, ending because nobody built the contingency when there was still time to build it cleanly. There's something in that which is genuinely hard to sit with. But here's what that hard feeling is actually telling you. Optimism bias isn't about being naive. It's a structural blind spot we all share, built into the architecture of forward imagination itself. Swift is the most honest mirror of it anyone has ever built. 22 years of evidence that even the best engineers, with every incentive to plan carefully, default to the best case timeline. You are not doing worse than NASA. You are doing exactly what human minds do. The difference now is that you can see it. So try this tonight. Pick one thing in your life that matters and that you've been running on best case assumptions. One relationship, one project, one plan. And ask the rude question, assume it's already failed. Assume it's 18 months from now and it's gone. What happened? Don't answer fast. Sit with it. Let your mind move past the first uncomfortable silence and into the actual answer. What you find there is the rescue mission. Write it down. Not because failure is coming, but because the mind that has imagined failure honestly is no longer the mind that gets caught flat-footed by it. Swift fell for 22 years without ever touching the ground. That's extraordinary. What's more ordinary and more instructive is that nobody built the net until the fall was already becoming something else. You can build yours now while the altitude is still yours to choose. You're someone who plans for the fall before it begins.